So it is my great pleasure today to introduce this Alfred Fessard lecture with Simon Thorpe. Simon is originally an Englishman, though now he's a French citizen. He was trained in Oxford, initially in physiology and psychology. He did his PhD with Edmund Rose, somebody that I think some of you might know. After his PhD, he went to Canada to work as a postdoc with Max Sinider. And then, quite early on, in 1983, he was recruited at the CNRS. So first in Paris for about 10 years. And then in 1993, together with a few other researchers, they moved to Toulouse, next to here, to start the Brain and Cognition Research Center, the CERCO, which is still there in Toulouse. I'm part of it, actually. So it's been there for more than 30 years now. Simon was the director of that institute for many years. He's had also many important positions in various committees, notably at the CONRS. And so with all of these positions, he's influenced quite a lot of our careers. I think not only mine today, but possibly the career of many people here in various ways. He trained a lot of students who became researchers. I was one of his PhD students. He recruited some of you at the CNRS. He probably evaluated some of your labs, some of your grants, and so on. So in a way, he really shaped the field of computational neuroscience, and I think it only makes sense that he's giving today this Alfred Fessard lecture as part of the Neuro AI Symposium. And today I'm very happy because you will all discover something that I already know, is that Simon is a man who has lots of ideas and lots of opinions, and today he's going to share them with us. So welcome, Simon, and congratulations.
Thanks very much, Rufin. So, really, I'm very honoured to have the opportunity to give the Alfred Fessard talk. Unfortunately, as I arrived in France in 1982, Alfred Fessard just died, so I didn't actually meet him. But I must say, looking about what he did, there are quite a lot of similarities. I mean, he worked in experimental psychology with Henri Pierron in the 1920s, looking at reaction times. And then he went to Cambridge for visits during the 1930s and came back with lots of cutting-edge neurophysiological techniques, EEG, but also recording from neurons. And as a result of that, he was at the start of the Institut Marais, which was set up in 1943, demolished in 1976 to make way for Roland Garros, the tennis courts. He was also a professor at the Collège de France from 1947 in neurophysiology. So I do think this mix of psychology and neuroscience and thinking about how the system works, it's pretty much what I try to do as well. So, what I'm going to do today, I'm going to try and sort of trace the history of the links between AI and neuroscience. Brain as an inspiration for AI, and this goes back a long way to artificial neurons, but I'm going to talk about feed-forward architectures for recognition and categorization, the importance of spikes, order-based codes, N of M coding I'm going to introduce to you, and then sort of finish off with a sort of brain-inspired AI. I'm going to tell you about perhaps my final project with my last student on PetaBrain. It's the idea of simulating, actually I'm going to show you this on my Mac, billions of neurons running on my Mac, but incredibly sparse. And this is this idea of cortical dark matter. Maybe the brain is much more quiet than we think, and that could be a key to why the brain only uses 20 watts, whereas all these big AI systems are ridiculously inefficient. So I'm going to do a quick history of AI and the brain. This is on the time scale. So I think it goes back really to 1943, Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts with their threshold logic units. This was, I think, the first attempt to do this. Of course, we had people like Alan Turing also thinking about how brains and the relationship between artificial intelligence and thinking machines and so on. But then there was Frank Rosenblatt during the late 50s and 60s with the perceptron idea. This is basically a bit like the Pitts-McCulloch thing, but you could take sensory inputs and have a sort of a threshold unit which makes a decision. And this was looking very exciting during the 60s until 1969, when Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert wrote a book called Perceptrons, where they basically said, these will never go anywhere because you can't build a system with more than one layer, and therefore forget it. And that literally killed off all this sort of approach, which was actually quite looking pretty good in the 60s. And so when I started my thesis with Edmund Rolls in 1977, and I was recording neurons in the orbitofrontal cortex and finding neurons that were bimodal for bananas, visual and taste at the same time, and thinking, oh, we need to model this. How do these neurons learn to do this? This is in the late 70s. I couldn't find anything in the literature, really. The only person really who was doing anything at the time was Fukushima. He had his papers on the neocognitron. I think that was literally the only thing I could find. So I thought, oh, well, I just have to keep doing neurophysiology and not worry about trying to make sense of this. But then things started to move. 1982, we already mentioned it yesterday, Hopfield nets. And then we had McClellan and Rummelhart with their interactive activation model of word reading, which is actually the first really clear connectionist model. Then we had Jeff Hinton, Jan LeCun, and various other people talking about backpropagation. Of course, that changed the world. But these people were involved in the PDP research group, and in 1986, these two books, I think they became like the sort of Bible for people in the lab. You know, these two books on how to build systems that were intelligent, made from lots of processes working in parallel. And of course, the paper by Rummelhart, Hinton, and Williams on backprop is a very important event. About that time, Terry Sejnowski was another really interesting person, because he'd come around to conferences with his net talk thing. Very impressive. This was a really, really simple network. It only had about 400 units in it, but you could hear it learning to pronounce words in English, starting off gibberish and then gradually learning also the irregularities in English. When there are plenty of irregularities. There's not a set system of rules that can really predict it, but it was doing this. This had everybody thinking, wow, this is going to go a long way. But then, I'll be quite frank, things started to. I was absolutely convinced. A couple more years like this, and everything will be aligned. But then machine learning came in, and I was going to these NIPS meetings, and it was all machine learning and maths and engineering, and basically people they weren't interested in the brain. So there was a sort of a second period where basically, the communication between people working in AI and people working on the brains basically died out. Then something very important happened. Fei-Fei Li very courageously labeled millions of images in categories and generated the ImageNet challenge. And of course, that was in 2009 roughly. And a couple of years later, well, the world changed because Jeff Hinton and his two students wiped the floor with computer vision with this paper, which has now been cited 155,000 times, which is basically the dumbest architecture you could come up with. It's a feed-forward net with 650,000 neurons and so many parameters, and you can see this is the performance on the ImageNet up until 2012. The blue dots are computer vision classic, and then this green dot is AlexNet, as it's called. At the time, humans could do better, and so the humans we'd still have a chance. But by 2015, we'd been outpaced, and right now it's like 99.1% correct on a task where humans only get 94. So that, as you know, the world changed, and then the second big thing was 2017 with Google Research coming up with the transformer models, and that's led to all these large language models from OpenAI, Meta, Google, Anthropic, Mistral AI in France, and so on. And everybody's talking now, are we already at artificial general intelligence? How long is it going to be before we have super intelligence? In other words, systems which are more intelligent than we are. Big debate. So that's my potted history of AI and the brain. My contributions, well, he says modestly, in 1989 I published this paper, which was basically a response to all these PDP modelers and who didn't really take into account the real brain. I mean, it was, there was McLennan and Rumelhart, all these things. It was, they weren't really talking about neurons, but I tried to sort of pin it down a bit. And one of the things I said in 1989 is that, well, I knew from working in Edmund Rolls' lab, you have neurons in the top end of the visual system that fire at 100 milliseconds after the stimulus comes on, selected for faces. They're 10 layers away from the retina. And I just sort of said, back of the envelope, 10 layers, 100 milliseconds, you've got 10 milliseconds per layer. There's no time to do to come back and loop on anything. Basically, it has to be a feed-forward pass. And this was backed up, I think, by my biggest hit, which was this paper in Nature in 1996, where we showed that when you flash up an image that the subject has never seen before, and you just ask them to release a button if they see an animal, they can do that really quickly, but also the brain shows us a very clear signal in 150 milliseconds to say, yeah, there was an animal there. And that really got people thinking. We did a whole load of experiments on that. And this is a widely used little figure that we came up with, showing in the monkey brain that basically you have to go as a feed-forward pass because you don't have time to come back. You have to add in the conduction delays, which are really significant. I mean, getting from V1 to IT in 40 milliseconds is literally the conduction delays at 1 meter per second. So I mean, it really is pushing the hardware absolutely to the maximum. And Rufin, my student, went off to Caltech and worked with Fei-Fei Li, and they had this very interesting paper on you can do this with a no attention, which was extremely interesting. And that got Fei-Fei Li thinking, and the reason why she did ImageNet, because she wanted to test artificial systems on this sort of task, categorizing scenes. So I think there's a direct link here between, coming up with feed-forward passing, and categorization to ImageNet, and hence to the revolution in 2012. He says modestly. I think that paper in 1996 really got people thinking. How do you do this? And that got people thinking. No, you don't have time to rotate models of things to match them up. No time for anything of that. So. Is that all we have to learn from the brain? Will AI continue to develop as it is currently, where people don't really care very much about how the brain does things? Well, I'm going to argue that no, and I think there's plenty of other things that we want to talk about. So classic neural networks, which are the things which are used in AlexNet, transformers, and just about everything, are basically these systems where you have units, if you like, and they're all generating floating point numbers. And then you have weights, which are floating point numbers, and you get a final activation, which is by multiplying all the weights and the activation levels, and you get some value, and then you feed it through a sigmoidal function or a rectifying linear unit or whatever. And then basically, these are very expensive computations. So even this, this really dumb neuron, it's only got 16 inputs. You've got 16 multiplications and additions, and then you have to put it through some output function. And if you're doing that for every neuron in the brain, not with 16 inputs, but with 1,000 inputs, this is extremely expensive. So to simulate the human brain using the model which most people are using, if you say you've got 86 billion neurons, and let's assume 7,000 synapses per neuron, I mean, this is a ballpark estimate. I mean, sometimes it can be 100,000, but anyway. And if you want to recalculate everything every millisecond to have a real-time model of the human brain, you would need 600 petaflops. Now, it turns out that this is the current list of the top 500 supercomputers on the planet. There are 3 that could do it, right? They're all in the States, actually. And they all use around 20 megawatts of power. There's going to be a European Jupiter exascale computer in Germany. It's going to be said, this is it. 2,300 square meters of computing platform. Oh, they've managed to get the power down below 20 megawatts. But we're still talking about these systems are literally 1 million times more energy expensive than the human brain at 20 watts. So what's the secret, right? I mean, there must be something that they're missing here. Well, Jeff Hinton, if you listen to him recently, he's, the godfather of AI, or one of the 3 godfathers of AI. Over 780,000 citations, really significant guy, super bright, by the way, as everybody knows. His suggestion, if you listen to him in recent talks, that it's because the brain is so good because it's using analog computing, basically doing multiplications in devices, the synapses, which is essentially an idea which is really quite common in neuromorphic engineering. It's the idea of using memristors. So you've got a sort of crossbar, and you have little devices which are the equivalent of synapses, and you can program these. It's very interesting, and yeah, it could be true. But I'll try and explain to you why I don't think that's the best way to go. Because there is an alternative hypothesis. And the alternative is that the difference between all these super AI systems and the brain is that we use spikes. Now, spikes, everybody knows that real neurons don't transmit continuous values. They send spikes. And this is a beautiful Purkinje cell in the cerebellum firing away. The problem is that all these deep learning trained neural networks, which are the state of art in AI, use floating point numbers for both the activations and the weights. There aren't any spikes. We know that neurons use spikes. Everybody knows neurons use spikes, but many people say, oh, well, listen, this isn't a problem because, the floating point numbers that we're using in our simulations are just the firing rate, right? And so basically you can convert firing rates into floating point numbers if you want. And we can basically forget about the brain using spikes. I think that's absolutely wrong because floating point calculations are ludicrously expensive. And a beautiful... And basically, rate coding is an extremely inefficient way of using spikes. A beautiful illustration of this is a debate. This was last year. The future of high-performance computing. Are neuromorphic systems the answer? We had Kwabena Bowen and Ralph Etienne Cummings, who were the pro-spike people. And then you had Yann LeCun, one of the other godfathers of AI, and Bill Daly, the chief scientist at NVIDIA, who was sort of anti-spikes. And it's really worth listening to this, because this is Bill Daly saying, look, energy utilization, NVIDIA uses, floating point or, use various other things, and this is the amount of energy required. And the spikes are off the scale there because they're stupid. He says this in this talk. He says, I will never use spikes if you have to use 255 spikes to send an 8-bit number. And that's because he hasn't understood that actually rate coding is a disaster. So the spiking view, standard view, is its rate that counts. So there are several methods you could do that. You can just count the number of spikes in a particular interval. You can measure interspike intervals, which allows you to get an estimate with just 2 spikes. You can also use Poisson rate coding. Actually, all of these are really hopeless. In particular, Poisson rate coding, never use it. We had a paper in 1998 which proves that it's about the most inefficient way of sending information you could come up with. And the reason I think these are all bad is because there's an alternative which is perfectly good. It's temporal coding. It's the idea that you can get processing done with a wave of spikes where the most strongly activated neurons fire first, and you can use the order in which the neurons fire as the code. And this is for a very simple reason. If you imagine a sensory neuron in the retina, for instance, if you give it a strong, modest stimulus, it charges up and fires a spike after a delay. If you increase the intensity or the contrast, it fires earlier, and so on. So you get this sort of intensity to latency conversion process going on. And according to that view, neurons are they are intensity to delay converters, not intensity to rate converters. Of course, if you let them keep firing, you get the rate, but you don't need the rate. You just need one spike. And the amazing thing, I wrote this was my idea in 1990, as we'll see. But I went back and discovered this was in the first paper ever published on the neurophysiology of the visual system by Lord Edgar Adrian in 1927. He got the Nobel Prize for this. It's not exactly he hid it. This paper on the action of light of the eye, this is recording from Eel optic nerve, and he had two intensive stimulus. He'd actually dissected away the fibers, so he's only recording from a limited number of them. And he had a really quite amazing thing that that measured the firing rate. And with a high intensity stimulus, you can see that this is a stimulus that lasts 3 seconds. You get higher firing rate and also higher maintained firing rate. So great rate coding. But just look at the beginning here, the latency is like half with the higher intensity stimulus. It's in the first ever study, 1927, and it was ignored for decades and decades. Everybody said rate coding, and this is true not just of engineers, it's neurophysiologists. You plot rate. You have post-stimulus time histograms, and so on. So, going back to my history of neurophysiology, that paper in 1989 said the same thing. This thing about you can't use rate coding because you've only got 10 milliseconds. You're only going to get one spike. Might get two, but I mean most neurons will only have time to generate one spike. And so in 1990, I had this very short four-page paper on spike arrival times and efficient code for neural networks. And that led on to things like, I think this is a paper that Rufin was involved in with face processing using 1 spike per second. This is 1998, if I remember rightly. And you can see this wave of spikes going through orientation maps and producing a neuron selective for faces at the top end. And because this was working so well with Rufin and Arnaud Delorme, who was actually the other guy really involved in this, we set up SpikeNet technology in 1999. And that company kept going until it was bought out by BrainChip in 2016. Now, what did we do at SpikeNet Technology? Well, it actually went very well for a couple of years at the beginning. What we discovered was using this intensity delay conversion trick, which we'd already talked about. It turned out that, so here we've got 16 neurons firing spikes, and we're going to use the order in which they fire to do processing. So one of the things we can do is pick off neurons that fire early. I mean, we actually, in 1998, we had a rank order code with Jacques Gautret, which turns out to be amazing, but way over the top. When you think there are 21 trillion orders with just 16 neurons, you don't need to decode all the orders. What you can do is do a simple trick, which is just to have a little circuit like this thing, which is sort of relay cells which have an inhibitory circuit which does a K winner take all. They count the number of neurons that have gone through, which are spiked and gone through, and then block any further propagation. I think this is actually what happens in the geniculate, for instance. So the retina sends spikes to the geniculate, but not all of them will go through because you've got this massive inhibitory circuits in there. Same thing in every sensory system, actually. You can actually do the same trick even at the input layer. So I mean, the retina itself could have local feedback circuits which could potentially count the number of neurons that are fired locally and then turn them off. And that's even more power efficient because you actually literally only need end spikes. You just let the end spikes fire. I think that's maybe not what the retina does. It waits to the geniculate. But anyway. Now, the thing is, if you then take this sort of circuit where you're only letting 4 spikes go through and you have neurons with binary connections, this is incredibly selective. So here we've got a neuron, it's 4, let's give it 4 weights, 4 connections, that's all it's got. If the 4 spikes hit those, the neuron says yes, and that is a JKCB detector. And these other neurons are each tuned to a different pattern. So, as you sort of change the pattern of inputs, different neurons will fire. Just to illustrate that you can actually do things. This is I'm going to do the same thing with 18 neurons. It's a 3x3 patch with 2 orientations at each location. If I show you that pattern, it's quite difficult not to see a face in it. Well, you can do that with 18 neurons, pick off the top of the first 4, and here we've got a neuron here, which is actually a face detector. And the probability of the 4 spikes hitting all 4 of the 4 synapses that the neuron has got is extremely low. If you get it, it's going to be something like 1 in 20,000 or something. It's just not going to happen by chance. So the trick is to control the number of cells that fire. If you do that, then life is very simple. And I believe that's what the brain does all the time. In every system, every sensory system, it's picking off and letting through the first neurons to fire. So SpikeNet's recognition engine was actually a one-shot learning algorithm where we took a patch of actually 28 by 28 pixels and picked off the highest value, the earliest neurons to fire in 8 orientation maps. It's exactly what Rufin in the paper from 1998. We just pick off, we learn the neurons that fire first. It's the same thing as this face thing, only with a bigger image patch and more different orientations. And so it's really simple. That model, you can store it with like 500 bytes. And that, if you copy that neuron, do sort of weight sharing, so you're testing that model everywhere in the image, you get, having learned this, you can see these red dots here are the neurons that have gone over a threshold. And you can see that this is incredibly invariant to luminance. I mean, this is so dark you can't really see anything. Contrast, you can be as low as you like. It's always the same neurons that fire first. We don't care about absolute values. It's just who fires first. You can blur it. You can add noise. You can rotate it. You can expand it. You can shear it. We were doing this in 2002. Now, why haven't you heard about this? Because actually we didn't really publish it, because it was a secret source that kept people's jobs at SpikeNet Technology. But I have managed to recover 2 publications which exist. One is this paper here, where you can see this is we trained on the eye of the cat, and you can see here it's localizing the 2 eyes, and it's taking for an image 150 by 150 pixels, it took 5.7 milliseconds per model. There's only one model here. Every additional model, you could have 1,000 models, it would take 5 seconds. This is in 2002. This is the other paper where we did this with 51 models created on randomly chosen well-known images like Batman logo, Bambi, the Fleetwood Mac Rumours cover, things like that. You just take anything, you make a model for it, and you make a montage, and it finds them all, tells you where they are, and that took 51 targets on an image that 298 by 200 pixels. It took 241 milliseconds. This is in 2002, right? 2 decades later, if you did the same thing with a CPU with 64 cores or something, and running much faster and so on, this will be blindingly fast. Unfortunately, I can't show you this anymore, because in 2016 we were bought out by a brain chip, and they put this away in a cupboard somewhere. They don't even use it, which is tragic. Which is why I'm making the story now. Basically we were sort of 20 years in advance on this, I think. Now, interestingly, SpikeNet, I've already shown how it works. It's got a really dumb mechanism. It's got the recognition layers are literally directly on the output of V1. That doesn't really look like the visual system. And indeed, AlexNet looks more like the visual system. because it's got 7 layers. And I actually, when it came out, I wrote to Alex Krzyzewski and said, well, 7 layers, that looks pretty much like the primate visual system. Were you following the biology? And he said, oh no, we just tried it and it worked. But actually, it does look quite like the visual system. However, SpikeNet, AlexNet will just tell you, what category of object is present. It doesn't count them and it doesn't locate them, whereas SpikeNet does. If you got multiple copies of something, it will tell you not only how many there are, but exactly where they are. So that's actually quite useful. Now, the brain doesn't do that because it's extremely expensive. You'd actually have to have neurons at every pixel for everything that you want to recognize. But it does do it for one thing, and that's faces. And we have this task we call face snapping that we developed, where we show people, flash up a large image on a screen with a randomly pasted in face. And the task is just to cater the face. As soon as you get there, we replace the image with another randomly located face, and you do that 500 times. And this is what it looks like. This is in real time. The red dot's the subject's eye. Now you're probably going to have a little bit of trouble in seeing what's going on. So I'm going to slow this down for you. Let's start at the beginning. So you start at the center. And now, this is about as complicated a scene as you can come up. Where's the face? There it is. Where's the face? Over to the left. Where's the face? Over to the right. Over to the left. Where is it? Oh, over to the right. I love this one. Where's the face? It was up in the sky. And that demonstrates actually that we made life as hard as we could by having the same contrast variations as the local image patch. There is nothing in the contrast that will tell you where the face is. This is scoop, right? The brain does exactly this. It does what SpikeNet does. It has detectors for faces all over the place. And this paper, which hasn't been published, it's under review for Neuron. This is Rick Groslis' lab at NIH. They find neurons in the superior colliculus that fire at 40 milliseconds to faces, and it depends on the V1. It's not the retina connected to the geniculate. If you to the superior colliculus, it has to go through V1 and the orientation map. So I think what's going on is you've got these orientation detectors which say, if you've got 2 horizontals here and a horizontal here and a vertical there, it's probably a face, make a saccade. And you can do that incredibly fast. That proves that the brain can do this, but it doesn't do it for anything except faces because it's just so expensive to do. But you can build a system that will do exactly that. That's what we did with SpikeNet 20 years ago. So interim conclusions. Biology actually uses spiking neurons, intensity to latency conversion, information contained in the order of firing, inhibitory circuits to control the numbers of the neurons that fire, which allows you to do this N of M coding, N being the number of neurons that fire amongst M. We're using binary synapses, no weights at all. And that is, I think, one of the tricks that can explain the remarkable energy efficiency of the brain. So just to sort of summarize, if you like, neural network computations, you've got conventional processing. This is where you've got floating point numbers all over the place, horrifically expensive. You can do event-driven spike processing, and there are these devices like DVS cameras and things like this, which send spikes. But you'd typically be using floating point weights inside anyway. You can make life better by having unary synapses. I prefer to say unary, by the way, not binary, because in fact the synapses can't be at 0. They're either there or they're not. And the more the push to the extreme, it's N of M. Unary synapses where you just let a few spikes go through. Now these things are all floating points and all synapses have to be calculated, so basically very expensive. These things are all much more simple. You just have to increment the target neuron's activation values. And in the N of M thing, it's controllable sparsity. I've already shown you the one-shot learning rule, which is, here's an image, pick off the n input things that come through first and just store those as binary weights to a neuron. That's the learning algorithm. Really, really simple. And I can learn anything with this. It can be images, it could be text, whatever. There are no zero weights. We call it zero-less computing. It's unary synapses. The question is, can you scale up these ideas? And that's where my last student, presumably, comes in. Aditya Kar, who's at the Circa, he's in his second year of his thesis. And he's been running simulations on actually this Mac. So it's a Mac Air with M2 processor. It's got 24 gigabytes of on-chip unified memory. This has only got 2 terabytes solid-state disk, but it's got quite impressive numbers of cores and everything. But it only uses 39 watts, even when it's running flat out. And this is a simulation, a video of a simulation that was done. But actually, let's forget the simulation. I'm going to show you this. I'm running now. This is running on my Mac. It's not quite as big because I've only got a 2 terabyte thing. You can see it's reading every time a packet of neurons fires a spike. You just read in who are they connected to, update the activation of those neurons. We're keeping a histogram of what the activation level is, such that we can pick off the n neurons that are going to fire on the next cycle. And this will run. I had this running in front of a poster for an hour and a half on battery. There was no plug. It's very, very power efficient. So it's using well under 30 watts of power. This simulation is doing nothing interesting because it's just all random connections, but it's just showing that the system is alive, if you like, just sort of randomly doing. But I've already told you a way of storing, creating neurons to order just by using the n of m trick and storing unary weights from the n neurons fire coming into the system. So watch this space. Very soon, I'm going to be able to show you. I was hoping to be able to show it today, actually, but we're not quite there yet. But I'm absolutely convinced we will be able to learn images, millisecond of processing per image, and store them with a neuron for every image, that sort of stuff. But you can also do this for text, sound, whatever you want. What's the future? Well, again, I'm disappointed that I'm stuck with this Mac Air because I'd ordered an M3 Mac with 128 gigabytes of unified RAM and 8 terabytes of disk. I would have been able to do a simulation with more neurons than in the human brain in front of you with this. And actually, the real problem is the off-chip storage of the weights. But you can buy these little PCI boards with 4 8 terabyte SSDs on it. And you can have 6 of those in a MacBook Pro. It's not a MacBook, sorry, a Mac Pro. It's a desk-based thing. That's 200 terabytes of memory. Total cost around 30,000 euros. That's enough to store. You need 4 bytes roughly per connection. So 200 terabytes, we've got 50 trillion connections. Doesn't have to be Mac. 2 days ago, it was announced that you're going to be submerged with new Microsoft Windows things running on this on Qualcomm's Snapdragon X Elite thing, which it has an NPU, neural processing unit, which does 45 tera operations a second. And everybody's PCs will be able to do this. And Macs and PCs. So, this is not going to stop. The basic thing about petabrain architecture is that let's take the case where I take 4 billion neurons, that's 2 to the 23. You can set up a system which is effectively a crossbar array where the number of possible synapses is 2 to the 64. That's 18 quintillion. That's the number of effective synapses that you could use. However, of course, you don't use all of those synapses, because we're not using zeros. But what this means is that you could never do an M-Mister, sorry Jeff Hinton, you could not do this on a M-Mister architecture, because you would need 18 quintillion devices in your computer. That's simply not going to happen. And that's where the zeroless unary computing thing comes in, because if you wanted, let's say, 256 connections per neuron, which is the sort of thing I was doing here, you can store those for 4 billion neurons, 4 terabytes. You can get 8 terabyte SSDs already. So how does this compare? I mean, there are other people doing spike-based computing systems. How does this, I should say petabrain, now we've changed it. People were worried that terabrain sounds a bit too pessimistic. Spinnaker, I mentioned this yesterday, this is Steve Ferber's big European project, flagship project. And this was in 2018, they turned on the Spinnaker system with supercomputer with 1 million cores. Each core could do 1,000 neurons, so you've got 1 billion neurons in all, but it's using 100 kilowatts. So it's maybe not supercomputer scale exactly, but it's still pretty expensive. Then you've got Spinnaker 2, developed by people in Germany, and they've set up a company called SpinCloud. And you can see, again, we're talking about racks and racks of these are ARM processors. The Spinnaker 2 chip. It's quite neat, but you need huge numbers of them to do this. So here's the Spinnaker 2 chip. Again, we're going to be talking about massive amounts of energy and space. And then here's the latest one. The world's first human brain scale computer will go live this next year. It's going to. It may be already on it's Deep South, developed by a team in Australia. They say 228 trillion synaptic operations per second. It's still using 40 kilowatts. I mean, we're not quite at it's 2,000 times more than the human brain. So the question is, why do they think they need 228 trillion operations a second to do a brain simulation? And I think the reason is they've listened to the story that everybody will tell you, which is that, well, not everybody. I've been asking questions around here. Neurophysiologists, what's the resting firing rate of cortical neurons? Many people will say 1 or 2 spikes per second. And I think that's what they used here, because if you take those numbers, that would mean that just for the cortex, you're getting tens of billions of spikes to process every second, thousands of synaptic updates per spike, etc. And that's where they need all these updates. But is it true that the brain is actually as active as that? I'm going to introduce the idea of dark matter. 1968, David Robinson published a paper on the electrical properties of metal microelectrodes. He noted that you're going through the cortex, you can listen to neurons firing in a sort of 50 micron radius. If you go through 2 millimeters of cortex, he said, you should record from 70 to 234 cells. But any neurophysiologists from Hubel and Wiesel onward who do 2 millimeters of recording and record more than a handful of cells, they're extremely happy. So he says, why there are so few it should be a puzzle for users of microelectrodes. That's still the problem today. When people say 1 or 2 spikes per second, the resting rate, they're talking about the neurons that are actually firing spikes. What about the other ones? Peter Lenny, 2003, had this very interesting paper where he estimated the cost of spiking and how many spikes the cortex could generate, given that he has an estimate for how much ATP is required every time you make a spike. And he said it can't be more than 0.16 spikes per second on average. And that's assuming that everything is just for spiking. I mean, he didn't include anything else in there. And then there was this paper in 2006, how silent is the brain? Is there a dark matter problem? They were saying, we don't know. It could be, 90% of the neurons could not fire spikes in the last 24 hours. Now, the methods are in principle there. We can do calcium imaging, we can do neuropixel arrays and just leave them in there and try and record absolutely everything that happens for weeks. You can do this. You can record from the same neurons for, actually over a year. And you can see in this paper, this is neural activity. You've actually got neurons down here that literally have zero spikes. Nowadays, this is a recent review paper on this. I mean, the story seems to be in sensory areas like mouse visual cortex. About 15% of the neurons literally don't seem to have any spikes at all. They're firing at less than 0.01 spikes per second. But I don't think we can necessarily conclude that because sensory areas, while the mouse is actually looking at visual stimuli, that's the figure for the entire brain. I mean, what's happening in my brain now? I don't know. That's the really interesting question. How many spikes is the neocortex generating per second? If anybody has the answer, see me afterwards. I don't think we know. But it's actually perfectly possible that we've completely overestimated this thing. And certainly the guys who say, rate coding, spikes, yeah. If we do a neuromorphic model with 1 or 2 spikes per second for every minimum, then we're doing real-time brain simulations. I don't think that's the case. Now, just to summarize, a lot of this was in my ERC grant, Memory Mechanism, Man and Machine, which finished a few years ago now. But as Rufin sort of, I like to make provocative claims. I made 10 at the before this thing started off, and many of them I think have turned out to be true. So humans can indeed recognise visual and auditory stimuli they have not experienced for decades. You can do this without reactivating the memory trace in the intervening period. These long-term memories require an initial memorization phase during which memory strength roughly increases with the number of presentations. I said at the time, I proposed a few tens of presentations might be enough to get the memory to last for a lifetime. Actually, I think it may be less. A few presentations may be enough. The point, sorry, Rufin, I never actually got round to doing the testing whether oscillations were useful for doing this, so let's leave that one. Storing such long-term memories claim involves creating effectively grandmother cells. I think that's perfectly viable. The neocortex contains larger numbers of totally silent cells, neocortical dark matter. The jury's out on that one. I think we just still don't know, despite all these fancy techniques that people have got. Grandmother cells could be made by making simple neural network models with STDP type things and competitive inhibitory lateral interconnections. Yeah, definitely. This selective only requires binary synapses. Actually, not binary. I would say unary. You don't switch a neuron weight from 0 to 1. It's there or it's not. And finally, artificial systems using memristor-like devices can implement the same principles, etc. I would get rid of the memristor thing. I don't think we need memristors. And do we need to replace conventional computing hardware? Actually, no. A Mac or a PC will do it. So, take-home messages. I think studies of the brain have had a massive impact on AI research. Temporal constraints, I think, really pushed the idea of feed-forward processing and led to the ImageNet challenge, Fei Li, that led to AlexNet and the deep learning revolution which followed. But then this ignores the importance of spikes for coding, order-based coding, NFM coding, unitary weights, petagram brain architectures with what I call zeroless computing. The thing is, you never multiply or add 0 to anything. If you can avoid that, then your hardware is a lot more efficient. So the activity is ultra-sparse, but also the connectivity is ultra-sparse. And maybe we have dark matter. And I think that's the key to understanding the 20-watt power budget. So when I hear that Microsoft and OpenAI are going to spend $100 billion building a 5 gigawatt AI center, I think, stop it, guys. This is stupid. You may have more money than you know what to do with it, but this is not intelligent. It's literally brainless. Google, same thing. They want to spend as much money as well. As I was saying yesterday, please just give it to us and and let us sort this one out. This is ridiculous to spend so much money building these massive AI systems, which require millions of training cycles. As Rufin was saying yesterday, I mean, brains don't learn like that. Brains learn, literally on the fly with learning algorithms where you show one stimulus and it's already learned stuff. We need to move towards that. So, clearly, I think AI still has a lot to learn from the brain, and I predict that in the next few years, the state-of-the-art AI will look more and more like brains than it does at the moment. And with that, I rest my case.
Thanks a lot, Simon. And I'm sure there will be loads of questions. I'm going to start here.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this very exciting, entertaining...
Provocative.
Not sure it's that provocative, but yeah.
Oh, well.
Why you're disappointed?
I'm very disappointed.
No, I want to highlight the elephant in the room, which is about training, right? So spikes are discrete elements, and so you cannot do backprop on it, which is kind of the skeleton of machine learning nowadays. And so how do you address this issue?
Right, well, I hate backprop. It works. It works if you've got $100 billion to spend, then it will work. However, I showed you the learning algorithm that we had in SpikeNet in 2002, which is you let spikes go through, you filter them so only a few get through, and then you have a neuron here which just in one shot you can store the pattern, and you can do this. Imagine that I'm running my petabrain simulation, and on every trial, there I had 4,000. Let's make it 100. You've got 100 neurons firing on every cycle, and you just simply say the most active other neuron around learns that thing. So the thing will be continuously learning about the things which are repeating in there. Will that do large language models? Will it do reasoning? I don't know, but it might do. And if it did, backpropagation is in the bin, because basically it's the stupid way to train a system.
Yes.
Thank you. It was really, really amazing to see all these advances. One thing that I was wondering is how do you make these more efficient neurons? Because with computers that use binary bits, because naively I see that you could just make a tally of the spikes that are coming until you fire, but it's still a simulation that might be very inefficient compared to what the brain is doing, right?
Actually, I think this is more efficient. So I didn't explain this point, but the N of M trick, where you saw, I've got billions of neurons on my Mac. I choose, let's say, 1,000 of them, any number you like. I propagate their spikes, and I've got a histogram of the activation levels in the system. And I just say, give me the 1,000 most active neurons, and they are the ones that fire on the next cycle. That is actually the equivalent of doing an oscillation. So you could take your billion neurons and do this with them. Choose your favorite theta or gamma or whatever thing. So on every cycle, you push the neurons up until n of them are fired, and then you relax it. But if I was to do that in the brain, it's actually you literally have to push up and down all the neurons, and that's very energetically expensive. So my guess is that thanks to this computational trick of just keeping the histogram, which is really cheap, I didn't stress this. It doesn't matter how big M is. I mean, I can do it with 4 billion neurons. I could do it with 4 trillion neurons. It wouldn't make any difference, because all you need to do is to keep the histogram. And so actually, in terms of I wouldn't recommend to anybody to actually simulate 1 billion neurons with an oscillation doing this, because you'd have to progressively update the all billion neurons until n of them have gone over threshold. So my guess is that actually doing the same algorithm in an intelligent computer simulation, it's going to beat
if there was
the brain.
a way to make microchips that would be more adapted to this kind of computation.
I think
it's already
okay, so could you make an ASIC chip that did only incrementing numbers and generating histograms? Yeah. Would it be more efficient than this? Yeah. It would be 1,000 times more efficient.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Simon, for this very nice talk. You mentioned noise in the stimulus, but not in the computation. Do you believe there is no noise in the brain?
I'm very happy with the idea there's no noise. The fact is that people, when you record from neurons, they look like they're doing a Poisson process, roughly. And many people say that, that's, the brain needs noise to do computing. But everything I've ever done, there's zero noise. And the ability of SpikeNet to do recognition was because the system was absolutely deterministic, and you know exactly which neuron is going to fire.
So it would not. You need that there is no noise.
No, you could add some noise on it. It would just make it work less well. But it's an interesting question. Is noise necessary to do cognition and so on? I don't know of any strong evidence that that's the case. So for the moment, I will just keep plugging on with absolutely boring, just counting neurons and not putting any noise. The fact is that some people have models of neurons where they have a little Poisson rate process on the output. So you've got the internal membrane potential. How do you make spikes? Oh, you throw a dice. And people who do this, I say, can you design to me a bit of biological hardware that can generate a Poisson process? It's extremely difficult. You need something like a Geiger counter or something to do that. So no, it just doesn't make any sense.
We have a question down here and then another one up there.
Wonderful lecture, thank you very much. And a wonderful overview of the field throughout all of these years within your career as well. I was wondering, you brought up this subject of dark matter in the brain, and it is extremely interesting. I found the concept really interesting. You linked it to long-term memory storage.
Yes, I didn't really.
How do you do that?
Okay, so my idea is that I'm 67. I watched TV programs when I was a kid, some of which I've never seen since, but I know I would recognize them instantly. Because they mark me so much that. But you can also imagine TV programs that you've completely forgotten about. That when you say, "Oh, Galasphere 347," I remember that from 1963. If you're old enough and you were in the UK, and we did experiments to show that. We took TV themes from French television, from the Institut National Audiovisuel, and we showed the themes. And we could guarantee that these are things that have never been rebroadcast anywhere. You cannot get a DVD or video of this. And we had people who were in their 70s, 80s, and 90s who saw this and Monsieur Camembert, whatever. And they could not have seen it for 5 decades. So my idea is, how do you store a memory that can last that long? The only way I can think of. If anybody has any other suggestions, please let me know. But if you create a neuron when you're watching that program, which is tuned to, the images and the sound of the theme tune for this program, that neuron will just never fire again unless you actually watch it, or if you dream about it, maybe. But basically, those neurons are safe, and so the dark matter idea is that's how you store long-term memories. You could store anything in a distributed pattern. I mean, hot field nets work, but they have a limited capacity. So if you've got 1,000 neurons and you store it at a distributed pattern, you can store 140 patterns with no interference. But if you keep sticking stuff in, the old memories get overwritten. So if you want to keep a thing which will stay active for 50 years, then having selective neurons works. And the other thing you need to make that, it has to be binary or unary synapses. If you try and store a memory with a set of weights, 0.47 and 0.83, there is no way that will stay there for 5 decades, because all synapses are being continuously rebuilt. The proteins in your synapses get renewed all the time. So the only way you could keep that information intact is by saying either synapses exist, and in that case you keep them there and you never turn them off, or they're not used, in which case they can disappear and we don't care.
So we have a question up here from Thomas, and I'm afraid this will have to be the last question.
Yeah. Here. Thanks a lot. I really enjoy your talk. I have 2 main remarks, and would bring me to one question at the end. Very minor remarks is your concept of neuro AI winters. I was too young for the first one, but for the second one, for us in decision-making field, it was not at all a winter. It was the decade 2000-2010 was very rich with a lot of interaction with learning system and neuroscience and even economics all together. So for me, it was not a winter. It was more like rich. But this brings me to the second point, which is that I love your end of encoding idea. And it seems to work very well for perception and with pyramidal cells. But pyramidal cells is just a fraction of neurons in the brain. You have a lot of neurons that have tonic firing, both in interneurons in the cortex or in subcortical structure. And don't you think that for other purpose than perception or maybe episodic memory, because of you have all these tonic firing neurons, other way of encoding, like still the firing rate you don't like, could be useful for other neural process?
Okay, so firstly, firing rate does matter when you're trying to move a muscle. So in the end, nobody cares about the order of firing of the motor neurons in the spinal cord. It really is just the amount of transmitter you release that determines the strength. Yes, you can have locally rate coding, could be useful for modulating things. But one of the very interesting things I didn't mention is that if you're talking about the neurons in V1 that project to V2, for instance, in other words, when you're sending information elsewhere in the brain, those neurons tend to be extremely silent, except when they got something to say. So even if you do have locally, inhibitory circuits with, a fair amount of activity going on, when you're actually sending information, the brain makes damn sure that you're not sending rubbish. And the way you can test that is by, if you've got antidromic stimulation, if you're recording in V1 and you stimulate V2 or V4 or whatever, and you discover that this neuron has an antidromic, you can activate it by an antidromic stimulation, and you look at its firing rate. This is Harvey Swadlow did this. They're incredibly quiet, except when they've got something interesting to say. So in terms of the long-range projections, I think, if I was going to say a very strong thing, it's those long-range connections do not have, spontaneous firing rate at all. You might have some, sort of internal computation going on, but clean up your act before you send it anywhere else.
Okay, so we will close the question session here, but please do not go away, because now that Simon has done his work, he's going to get his reward.
Oh, I didn't know about this.
Yeah, well.
Thank you very much for this great lecture.
Yeah.
And on behalf of the Société des Neurosciences, I would like to present you with this medal to commemorate this event and also to recognize your invaluable contribution to the field of neurocomputation for our community.
Well, thank you very much. Wow. Well, Thank you very much indeed. Well, I certainly hope that Alfred Fessard would find the talk interesting too. I suspect he would have done. Okay, thank you very much.